So, Jamil has mentioned that one of the main issues around the work of Edward Said was about not only the permission to narrate, and he's been talking a lot about the Nakba and the Palestinian national history and the erasure of that history. And what I'm going to talk about is precisely how we have to not only readdress that erasure and take issue with our disappearance from history, but also who gets to speak for whom. And therefore the title of my talk today is When History Has No Words. And the beginning of my talk today is marked by a quotation from Marek Edelman, who was a Jewish fighter in the ghetto, in the Warsaw ghetto, and he was one of the last survivors of the ghetto who was fighting within to liberate the ghetto from the Nazi assault. Marek Edelman wrote a memoir which was titled The Ghetto Fight, Warsaw 1941-1943. And the book, which is his memoir of what went on inside the ghetto during the resistance, was basically censored in Israel for many years. He was himself considered persona non grata in Israel for many years. And the reason why he was considered persona non grata and his book was censored was that in his book, in his memoir, as well as in many interviews, and there was a very interesting also book that came out where he talks of the events in an interview, a long interview with a Polish journalist. He talks about how the resistance in the ghetto, and in his own words, he says, 40 years ago we fought not only for our lives, we fought for life in dignity and freedom. Another thing that Edelman notably said in one of the interviews that he released before dying a few years ago, which was reported in the Guarda, in Haaretz, and many other newspapers. I couldn't find the original interview in Polish. He said, we fought for the life of Jewish society in Warsaw. We fought solely for life, not for territory and not for national identity. And since I read the Ghetto Fight, his memoir, I had been thinking a lot about what he meant by fighting for life and for freedom of everyone, not just of the Jewish, but particularly, of course, for the survival of the Jewish communities in their own home, in Poland in this case. And I started to inquire, what does it mean to take this notion of home, fighting for a home, for the creation of home, rather than for a homeland, seriously, and what does it mean, what does it say about Palestine and Palestinian resistance? And this resonated a lot in the last few years. I've been working very closely with refugees and refugee camps. I've been conducting field work over the past years, between 2010 till recently, across several refugee camps and outside, mainly with refugees, collecting testimonies, oral histories, but mainly rehabilitating refugees as political subjects. As we all know, refugees are always represented as victims, voiceless, seamless, static, just awaiting teleologically for their return, and their political subjectivity, their political visions, their critique to the system, to the states they live in, their fights for rights, as well as for return, are very often sidelined or not given enough voice. So my work has been really about collecting this and giving space to this political subjectivity, to this emerging political subjectivity, particularly in the light of the fact that refugees have been abandoned by their political leadership from Oslo onwards. So I've been thinking about what does it mean to look at home as a site of resistance, and particularly what is lost. The main question I'm kind of lingering over is what is lost in war and displacement? What is it that people lose, and what is it that they are trying to recuperate? So I'm interested in not only in rehabilitating the Palestinian narrative, in the permission to narrate, as Edward Said used to, of course, talk about, but also about what does it mean to think about the concreteness of home against the abstract notion of a homeland. Also drawing a lot of inspiration from Marek Edelman, who wrote particularly poignantly about this. Of course, we as Palestinians have been denied the permission to narrate our story. But I think that, and we have, in the attempt to retrieve our role in this history, we have been very, of course, reasonably focusing on facts, on events, on attempt to bring about our counter-narrative, our counter-history of what went on in these events. But, so our focus has been in the nationalist rewriting of history, as Charles Dumas calls it, on the eventful. And of course, in this process of re-narrating the history, some power relations are at work, some people speak, some people are silenced. Very notably, women have been not only less interviewed, but themselves, they don't consider their own experiences as valid, as authentic, as legitimate sources of history. So there are power relations in the work of memory. So the Palestinian history is not a monolithic history. Some voices are given more space, more credit than others. And I think there is also a story or a history in the silences. So there are not only people who are silenced, but there are also stories that are told by not speaking. And this is what I would like to focus on. So I'm interested in my wider work, and my talk today actually draws from an article I've published in Antipode, the Journal of Radical History, on women's narrating what I call embodied histories, or histories, or emotional histories and histories of emotions. So I'm interested in the story that lies in the silences, in the way in which the bodies narrate, and what does that whole approach tell us about what went on in many ways. Let me just say that one of the other things that was happening when I was writing this article and doing my work and collecting my interviews is that the Rojava resistance was going on, and the media in the West were very focused on bodies and the bodies of these women, rightly so, the Kurdish women fighters. There was a lot of attention on the resistance that these women carried out, and a lot of emphasis and visibility towards this, really toward the embodied nature of this resistance, how rehabilitated were finally women in the Middle East fighting against an oppressor that was eventually also an oppressor that we like to defeat. So in that way, the reason why these women were also represented was that they were fighting the Western enemy, not so much in their own rights. But nevertheless, there was a lot of attention. This taught me also to think about how certain bodies are given space, representation, bodies that resist in the public, in the eventful, and the same. So in a way, I kind of came to the conclusion that we have, particularly in the West, but not only, two main ways of representing resistance, two main grids to think about resistance and memory and the work of memory. One is what we would call a nationalist imaginary, a nationalist grid, where the body is either a subject or an object of violence or of resistance. So we are very, very familiar with images of bodies and also histories of bodies that fight in the public sphere, bodies that, as we see some images, demonstrate, resist grief in public, that mobilize also sometimes their ascribed gender roles, particularly in the first Intifada. Women were prominent in the struggle. They were not only demonstrating, but they were also mobilizing and politicizing their traditional roles, reproducing children for the nation, helping the wounded, and so on and so forth. So there is a focus on the body that is the body that acts in the public, the body that narrates the events, the bodies that struggle or resist. Or we have a feminist grid or imaginary that focuses very much on the bodies that resist against the patriarchal structures. This has been very clear in the context of the Middle East, of Palestine, but not only, where we have been also at the Palestinian academics have been producing fundamental research, particularly feminist historians and anthropologists and social scientists, about how the gender agenda and the need for liberating women was also and always an agenda that lies alongside the national liberation. However, the question is that the feminist imaginary of the body that resists and fights actively and very often in the public or political domain is what is at stake here. And in both these imagination or imaginaries or grids, the domestic and the ordinary are somehow represented as existing in opposition to the political, rather than as producing political subjectivity in their own terms. So that leads me to kind of think that resistance whether feminist or nationalist, frames what I would say is the legible form of the modern political subject. And here, of course, I'm drawing from a lot of material from feminist political theory, Judith Butler, and also in the Global South now, academia has been producing very interesting analysis from that point of view. So I'll just kind of share some of the images just to give some flesh to what I've been talking about. So for example, Palestine has, one of the gender metaphors in which Palestine has been represented is through the metaphor of a woman. Palestine as a fertile land, as a motherland, as a reproducer of the nation. So this is one image. Grieving, mourning, mourning in the public and political dimension of mourning. Tradition, women as, of course, embodying the tradition, and we know how important, I'm not downplaying the role of tradition, we know how tradition is crucial in the permission to narrate, in the attempt to rehabilitate, and to, actually in the indigenous struggle, as Ilan talks about in a recent article, in the indigenous struggle that resist the forcible eviction of Palestinians of their own culture, of their own tradition, of their own food, of their own environment and habitat. So tradition is very important. Here you see women in the kind of usual traditional embroidery clothes, giving you an immediate sense of the nation and the resistance through that kind of performativity. Armed struggle, of course. This is Dalia al-Mughrabi, but we may have others. There has been very interesting also research that's been produced on how can we understand the role of the gender role of women in the armed struggle. The younger generation of the Intifada, first and second, and more recently the more popular widespread struggles. Again here is the eventful, the public dimension of the struggle that takes center stage. The resistance of the mothers, so the resistance of the mothers for asking accountability and the end of impunity for the killing of their children. The resistance of women, of religious women, and of course children. And we are all very familiar today with the horrendous plague of, it's not a plague, actually crime of the 300 or more children that are lying in Israeli prisons, and one of the most now sort of famous figure is Tamimi, who's spent her 17 years, the birthday when she turned 17 in Israeli prison, and she's being punished for emasculating the Israeli army by just with her own body resisting and shaming with her innocence this brutal occupation. Now, let me now move on to what actually interests me. I'm not saying that I'm not interested in all these other forms of resistance, but what I want to talk about is the power, or is the history that, as I said, in my title has no words. So what goes unnoticed in these feminist and nationalist frames? What goes unnoticed, I think, is the power of women like this, women who I met in Palestine, but also in Jordan, in Lebanon. And this woman was someone who I met just walking. She was lying in her land in Batir, next to Jerusalem. Batir is an area that has been declared by UNESCO as human, how to say, World Heritage for its very antique, ancient way of irrigation. You see it's very green, and of course Israel has been trying to seize this land, and successfully, because they have built a wall around it. So this woman was just, I was walking there with a friend, and she was just sitting there and feeling happy, sitting there and owning her land, owning her with her own presence. And this, of course, doesn't mean much, but it made me think a lot. You know, what does this act of sitting there and observing and stating, this is my place, this is where I belong, this is my home. And in a way there was also the affective dimension of this body sitting on this land with so the visual image that you can kind of, very moving, that you can kind of also infer from here. And so again, moving from these kind of encounters, and then I moved on to write about women's memories and embodied memories. So I'm asking, what is lost in war and displacement? And as Mark Edelman was arguing, what is lost during occupation and siege and displacement is home. Not so much homeland as an abstract notion. And how can we apprehend war and displacement, but also exit? So not only narrate and retrieve and make public what happened, but also exit the framework that enabled its very occurrence, as Judith Butler argues. And how do bodies connect to the war? This is something that interests me a lot. I'm interested in the transformative powers of bodies that do not resist or exist in the eventful, but who exist and resist in the ordinary, in the domestic space, in the space of the mundane, where nothing has supposedly happened. I'm interested in the power of vulnerability as a discourse of resistance. Judith Butler has argued that grief is a political process of disorientation of the self that allows us to recognize the grief of others, the vulnerability of other bodies. So I'm interested in taking that forward and look at what does this tell us about what went on in the Nakba and the Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, as Jamil was talking about, that is not something that happened and finished in 1948, but continues and continued in 67, in 56, in 73, in 1970 in Jordan. And if you take the history of refugees, it has never stopped. In Lebanon, in the War of the Camps, the Shabra al-Shatila massacre, again in Jordan, the Black September. So it's a constant process of erasure, of displacement that continues until today. And today in the West Bank itself, it is particularly poignant, the fact that, as some of the people we talked to in our interviews, being a refugee is a universal condition. Everyone is displaced. It's not anymore something that pertains to refugees only. So the deprivation of home and against the loss of homeland. And I want to take you now in the last few minutes that I have left to the histories of these women that have not been narrated to me as part of an attempt to narrate, but as in the Edward Sahidian terms. But there were a lot of notes and transcripts that I took home with me from my interviews. We collected 130 interviews, me and my colleague Sophie Richter, across camps and with refugees. But when I came home and started to analyze this material, I realized there were a lot of material that wasn't center stage. I didn't interview these women as witnesses of the events, but they were center stage in my notes. And these were women like Ala. Very often they were the grandmothers of the person I was interviewing, or the sister, or just the neighbor who happened to be there bringing some tea or a present, and she interjected with her story. I have to say also, so I realized that all this material was saying something, and I wanted to make sense of it. So I want to take you, and I'm going to read now from my paper because I think it gives you a much better sense of the narrative. From the stories of these women that are, as I said, embodied stories, embodied narratives, and memories of the body. So let me talk about Hassan. This is Ala, but it can be Hassan. And all of these women can be my grandmother, actually, because all of them convey to me a sense of collective history and a sense of subjectivity and positionality that even just through the way they were sitting, the way they were talking, the way they were moving their head, the way they were dressing, what they were cooking, and all of that. So it's a story within a history, but it's also the story that lies in the collective memory. So let me turn to Hassan's words and work of memory. So Hassan is someone who throughout all her life, which was mostly consumed moving across refugee camps and precarious shelters, gave birth to 13 children, 2 of whom passed away soon after birth. And under those harsh circumstances, Hassan breastfed her children, her daughter's children, and also the children of any woman who needed it. And she says, whoever needed to go out to the market, she says with a very proud and self-complacent smile, brought their children to me to be breastfed. And her friend, Nasser, confirmed enthusiastically, I saw it, she breastfed the whole refugee camp. So clearly Nasser and Hassan attributed to this bodily performance a heroic status, the expression of a hyper-nurturing power that became also an act of intergenerational solidarity among women. In the background of the suspension and violent disruption of gender roles forcibly enacted by the loss of place and space, Hassan extended her nurturing role beyond the domestic and the intimate realm, and suspended and reconfigured kin relations in the new shrunk microcosm of the camp. There are also other spheres in which caring and nurturing roles extend beyond the immediate family and are reenacted and unfolded in a network of care and support among neighbors, friends, sisters in the camp, which in a way simultaneously have created the sense of the camp as a collective family. There is an ethos in the camp that, there is a love and hate relationship, but there is a sense in which the camp is a family and is your and also the people who live next to you are reconfigured as kin. So one of the narratives that figured very centrally in many of these women's accounts was that for them being displaced meant not having the space anymore to consume the daily tasks of reproducing the family, of carrying out the ordinary tasks of cooking, of providing the security to their children that were, of course, evicted and forcibly displaced and cleansed with them. So a lot of the women told me we used to sleep, have children, and eat all in one room, and this was at stake, the loss of security, space, what home is, effectively. And Hassan stated loudly with an embarrassed smile while searching for a complicit recognition of what the curtailment of this domestic space meant for her and for other refugee camp women like her. Because when home is reinvented in a compressed space, in a crowded camp, women often refer to the shame, for example, ensuing from consuming acts of sexuality, of reproduction in the first place, but also simply domestic or family business in overtly exposed places where the ears and gazes of kins and neighbors could just violate their privacy and mortify their honor. So for many of the women I talked to or who talk to me, the grief is over the loss of the intimate space and of the private space. And their agency is expressed in their striving to reinvent or renegotiate the boundaries of privacy and intimacy. Now, what is interesting that Hassan continues remembering and narrating about her past, and she stumbles over a significant event that was very traumatic when her cousin and nephew were killed during an attack, sometimes in the 80s, she recalls. An operation that failed because one of the companions of the group may have betrayed the others. And her recollection of the facts and of the dates is very muddled. She doesn't remember the dates, whether it was before or after the first Intifada. She doesn't kind of have that temporality in her way of accounting for events actually at all. But what she remembers is, and she talks about, is how she had to travel to Jordan to Palestine from Jordan, because as a woman she was allowed to cross, to collect the pieces of the martyred body that was lying on the ground after 40 days, and she wrapped them around her waist to bring them home, to give them burial. So one would be tempted, of course, to think of Hassan as a Palestinian Antigone, a heroic female figure moved by compassion and kinship to give decent and dignified burial to her male king, martyred in an unclear circumstance. Yet there was nothing heroic about the ways in which Hassan herself talked about her tragic journey. Neither she recollected it through the prism of martyrdom or resistance. She displayed no lamentation or ululations. She just talked about this as part of her ordinary duties, not dissimilar from preparing food, fetching water, or harvesting or cropping the fields in the 1948 times when she was a peasant. So Hassan, of course, in this redefined nurturing role, contributes to create a sense of the ordinary that sustains life against the loss of place and space, and I think is exemplary of processes of subjectification that take place across the public and the private, connecting the eventful to the ordinary. Let me move to my last story, which is the story of Muhammad. Because Muhammad talks back precisely to the other mainstream greed that we used to analyze resistance, and I talked about this earlier on. Muhammad is an 83 years old refugee woman living in Haisha camp next to Bethlehem. And she carries onto her body the scars of the violence and uprooting that happened in 1948 and in subsequent years, as she and her family continued moving from one camp to the next, from one home to another, in search for a safe life. The first time she had the miscarriage was in 1948, as she was escaping from the Jewish militias who were approaching Ras Abu Ammar, implementing the village of her husband where she was living, implementing the project of erasing the indigenous population. Together with other women, Muhammad had the role of going back and forth to the village to rescue as many items as possible from their houses and help the elderly escape. Pregnant, she recounted having to carry over her head all the properties she could collect. On one of those journeys back to help her mother-in-law escaping, Muhammad felt a deep pain that she endured for 2 days, eventually ending in a miscarriage. And she says, it happened in a room in Irtas, the village they escaped to. After we reached Irtas at night, I had a pain and lost the baby. In the same room where she was losing her baby, her sister-in-law was giving birth. We were in Irtas, again, this is Muhammad talking, in one room, 10 people in one room, and my husband's brother's wife was pregnant. And she gave birth to her baby boy, and in that room she evoked. As Muhammad recalls, her narrative tangibly conveys the exhaustion that her family's daily survival entailed during the first critical moments after the forced uprooting. We lived in Irtas for 6 months, she says, and for 2 months in that room. We were 2 families. Women would sleep inside and the men outside. It was horrible. We were cold, and we would go outside to try and find some food and wood so that we could eat and be warm. Then we left to the Haisha camp. After that, we moved to the village of Beit Jala. There was no water in the house we lived in. We walked every day to go and get the water. So in one of those days, when she was working to get water, and after a year from the first miscarriage, she says, I was 8 months pregnant, and the Jews, as many of our grandmothers and up until today, to say the Jewish militias, the Israeli army, in Palestinian language you say Yahud, made an incursion during Christmas Day. They came to the house we were in. We were almost 4 families in the same house again. At that time, Muhammad wasn't home, yet she wasn't spared injury. The Jews shot me while I was fetching the water. Here, look, she shows me where she was injured. This is from the bullet. She told me while lifting her dress to show her scar. Muhammad's memory now flows unrelentingly. I had another daughter. Everyone had left the house, and my daughter was still inside. She was little, so I came back and took my daughter. Before the Jews put a bomb under the house, and they bombed our house. I ran away with her and left everything behind me. They shot me, but I thank God my daughter was just slightly affected by the bullet. I told my husband to take our daughter and leave me there. He left. I was trying to walk. I would walk and sit a little because I felt that the baby inside me wanted to go outside me. And then I sat somewhere and I couldn't move anymore. Now the path of Muhammad's narration runs fast and with lucid precision, ending with the memories of another loss. I lost her. She died from the bullet. It was in 1953. Now, Muhammad, whose life was devastated by the Israeli occupation and violence, concluded her plot, lingering over how mortified she felt that she had become infertile for several years after being shot. After this, I stayed 7 years without getting pregnant, she said. My mother would tell me, you have to get pregnant because your husband is the chosen Mukhtar. He is the community leader. He's an important person. You should let him marry someone else. So I asked him to go and marry another woman. He was the Mukhtar, such an important person. And he could not just be left with 2 children. So the eventful in Muhammad's narrative is obviously the loss that her husband, as an important Mukhtar, had to endure, rather than her own trauma and the sacrifice she made by letting her daughter and husband leave and her staying there back in the house. Of course, Muhammad's sensibility would be confined to invisibility or interpreted through the lens of her subordination to patriarchal orders in the feminist lens that we used to adopt in understanding these acts. Yet, if one of the most devastating effects, and I'm concluding here, of violence is indeed the loss of criteria around what love or heroism or grief or pain are, as an anthropologist of India, Benadas, has argued, then Muhammad's act and memory, focusing on safety for her child and her husband first, and on her husband's status later, are precisely an expression of that search for criteria, affecting the immediacy of relations of connectedness. Rather than passivity or lack of agency, these acts can be seen as a political effect of love, an act of connection, so that life can continue, and with it, the return of criteria and context that are deeply and tragically lost in war and displacement. Such acts endeavor to limit the pain and stems from the perceptions of one's bodily vulnerability and injury, what Judith Butler talks about as grief as a political process of disorientation. So, one's bodily vulnerability and injury as potentially that of others. So, and I conclude, read through those lenses, Muhammad's act, as that of many other women, that I didn't have the time to, of course, present here, is an expression of a performative agency producing an effect of dislodging the modern liberal nationalist subject of history. And I'll stop here. Thank you.